The world continues to watch the military conflict in Ukraine, wondering how long it will continue and how bad it will get. And of course, here in the West, we are also wondering how much of a threat and issue the recent spy balloons and unidentified objects flying around us are to our and our families. Joining us today to discuss this is Dr. Christian Leuprecht. He is a military expert and professor at the Royal Military College of Canada at the Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Welcome to Bridge City News, Professor Leuprecht.
Hello.
It's great to have you on. Let's start out with the flying debris in our skies. Can you tell us if these various balloons and flying objects are for certain coming from Russia or China, or could any be any of the fragment of truth to the theories that the US and Canada are using this as some kind of fear tactic to manipulate the public for unknown reasons?
Well, so we know that probably the first balloon was by a state-run entity. The other balloons were probably by private entities. But of course, the challenge when it comes especially to China is that there's no obvious distinction between public and private, because private companies are imbued with the structure of and representatives from the Communist Party of China. And so while China will say, yes, that these are research balloons, case in point is that this is dual purpose technology that is being used both for research purposes and for espionage purposes. So these are malicious actors that, how many other countries inadvertently send balloons into our airspace? Look, this is quite deliberate. This is quite intentional. And I think it's just a new reality of yet another area where malicious actors are pressing us hard in undermining our sovereignty and our sphere of action.
Right. Now, in your recent article in the Globe and Mail, you point out that these air intrusions do reveal that we are unfortunately vulnerable to our enemies. How vulnerable are we?
Well, the success of this continent really since 1940, in what is known as the Kingston Dispensation, has really been built on the security of the continent, where Canada and the US got together and basically forged a pact, a functional arrangement where they agreed that anything that poses a threat to one country also posed a threat to the other country. And so that they built a joint system to defend the continent, the airspace of the continent, but also subsequently the maritime approaches. And that strategy has arguably made North America the most prosperous, politically stable, and desirable continent that history has ever known. And so when you're able to demonstrate that actually those defenses can be breached, and you're very deliberately sending a signal about the vulnerability of being able to breach those defenses, that is a clear signal on one hand by an adversary who is intent on bringing geostrategic competition to our own continent and our own skies. And it is also a realization on our part that what we have been doing and investing in keeping the continent safe, secure, and protecting our sovereignty has been insufficient relative to both the intent by our adversaries as well as the capacities and capabilities that our adversaries have built and are building in order to press us hard in this new era of geostrategic rivalry.
Right, that makes a lot of sense because the citizenry can be distracted by work and living and day-to-day tasks, and then the governments can maybe have other things on their plate. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how U.S. and Canadian governments are reacting to these new airborne threats? And perhaps maybe a better question is, how should they be reacting?
So, as you can see, the reactions come entirely from the United States, including the first balloon that crossed Canadian airspace, ostensibly Yukon and all of British Columbia, without any announcement or so from the government of Canada. To the contrary, the only announcement we got was that we called in the Chinese ambassador to express our apparent displeasure And I have a feeling, given that the way that China has treated Canada, the Chinese ambassador would have been unlikely to take any lectures from Canadian officials. At the same time, you get the U.S. Secretary of State coming out explicitly saying that this is a brazen violation of our sovereignty. It is a brazen violation of international law. So you can contrast those two reactions, and you might ask yourself, so why is it that the Canadian government has not been more forceful? I mean, you can also put this in the context of recent revelations of everything from influence campaigns in China, of academics, private sector people, politicians, to Chinese attempts to manipulate our election system, secret police stations that China runs in this country, all of it apparently with impunity and all of it without much pushback from the federal government. So you can see two very distinct approaches when it comes to China, and I think that does not bode well for the overall defense of the continent, because ultimately Canada and the United States need to be on the same page when it comes to continental defense and continental sovereignty. And it appears, just based out of the statements and the approaches that two capitals are taking, that is increasingly not the case. We're on divergent paths. And I think that does not bode well for the strategy that has made Canada the country that it is today.
Well, this sounds like actually just a tip of a very large iceberg. So you mentioned the Chinese military police stations or outposts, and you've also mentioned the election interference. What do you take away from that as far as how maybe China views Canada?
Well, we know exactly how China views Canada, because if we look at last November's meeting in Bali, where Xi Jinping effectively humiliated the Canadian Prime Minister, it clearly showed that China has complete disregard and complete disrespect for this country. And so this is why it's puzzling to me that our federal government continues somehow to try to thread the needle with an adversary that has clearly shown that they have no intent of respecting us or our interests. And so I'm not sure how we can actually run a collaborative approach with such a country, and I'm not sure what that strategy would ultimately look like. So, in that regard, I think we continue to have these sort of very disparate sort of approaches, trying to appease China on the one hand. On the other hand, we then come out sort of very forcefully or somewhat forcefully when it's revealed that China is interfering in our affairs in one way or another. None of these revelations are new. Everything that's been in the news has been things that have been known for 5, 6, 7 years, as long as the federal government has been in power. The only real difference that we see here is the fact that it is now making national news and that the government now has to react to it. And of course, the government is on the back foot here. And so the way government, I think, is trying to craft the narrative is that somehow they are surprised and that somehow they're going to be more forceful. But I think we've gotten a lot of words from ministers and the Prime Minister. We haven't seen a lot of action. The only action that we've seen from the Prime Minister in response to the reporting by the Globe and Mail is that the Prime Minister has directed CSIS to find out who showed those documents to the Globe and Mail. So the preoccupation seems to be to continue to control the narrative and to control the message, rather than actually taking concerted and forceful action to protect our democracy, our prosperity, and our security.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I like the way you described it as threading a needle. And especially with the federal government wanting CSIS to see where the leak was that went to the press, instead of dealing with what we think is a major issue of a foreign communist entity involved in our federal elections. Do you think that there's a practical solution to this for Canada?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of approaches. So one thing is, of course, when it comes to continental defense, when the government issued Strong, Secure, Engaged, its defense policy that it is now looking to update in 2017, it explicitly excluded NORAD renewal. And NORAD, of course, is the organization that has been tasked since 1957 as a functional joint operational arrangement to protect the sovereignty and security of the continent. So it is puzzling that at a time of geostrategic competition, Canada would not double down on the protection of the continent. Foreign agent registries, as have been implemented by both Australia and the UK, that anybody who directly or indirectly lobbies on the part of a foreign government needs to register doing so. There's a whole host of reasons why you would want to do that, but one of it is simply that some of the activities that China is engaged in can be very difficult to prove in court and can be very difficult to convict people for. So if you have a foreign agent registry, at that point it becomes relatively easy to take action against people because you don't need to prove higher sort of thresholds of, for instance, violation of election law or criminal law, for instance. You can simply show that, well, you violated the foreign agent registry. And so it comes with a whole bunch of bunch of restrictions that allows you to control this type of activity.
Right.
Look, if the reporting is correct by the Globe and Mail, then CSIS was well aware of at least a senior Chinese diplomat in this country being actively engaged and directing activities that were meant to interfere with a Canadian federal election and our democratic institutions. The government has the opportunity to declare that person persona non grata and evict them from the country if they are a diplomat. Again, right. The government kind of did nothing. It was aware of what CSIS was observing and took no action. We could be having RCMP investigations, but of course we all know what challenges our federal police force has simply trying to do the basic day-to-day work. So I have relatively little confidence that this organization would have currently the assets, the skill sets, the capabilities, or the capacities to run some of these extremely complex investigations that would be required to root out some of the foreign interference. So the government could double down on making sure that what is ostensibly our federal and national police force has the commitment and the ability to deliver on those federal and national mandates. But as we recently saw in the report from Justice Rouleau, the Emergencies Act inquiry, 5-volume reporting, it appears that there continue to be significant deficiencies when it comes to the ability of the RCMP to respond, even in the case of a national emergency. So there are lots of things that the government could be doing, but it appears that none of these are a significant priority. I'm not exactly sure why. It might be because the government feels that those things are distracting from its own policy agenda that it wants to implement. It might be the government feels that these things are too controversial among the electorate, so it doesn't want to have that conversation. It might not want to be poking the dragon, so to speak, when it comes to China. But one thing that appears to be clear is that we still don't have a concerted strategy and a coherent strategy when it comes to containing the challenges that China poses to Canada and Canadian interests at home and abroad.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot. You had mentioned the word competition, and of course there seems to be a lot of that competition between nations right now. But the thing that I just wanted to touch on briefly before, as we get close to wrapping up, is maybe that capacity. We could talk about the Canadian sovereignty in our Arctic areas. And one can hear alarming information from former military personnel on just how unprepared the Canadian military has become. But can you talk about that capacity briefly, maybe not just about the military, but also the RCMP in dealing with these national security issues?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to the Arctic, so there's a broader issue of the Canadian Armed Forces that has really suffered from 20 years of benign neglect from governments from both sides of the aisle. And now there's so many fires that are burning, I think, that the government is having a hard time to figure out what to deal with first. And really what the organization needs is a 15-year, probably, reconstitution plan to rebuild the organization so it can perform for the government and can perform for Canadians. But the broader challenge is still sort of looking at this in siloed approaches. So when we look at Arctic, we look at Arctic defense, for instance, rather than understanding what the weaknesses that our adversaries are exploiting quite systematically when it comes to our political institutions, our economy, our diplomacy, cyberspace, and that what you've been mentioning and what we've been observing is simply part of a broader pattern of our adversaries using what is known as gray zone activities, hybrid warfare, activities below the threshold of armed conflict to undermine us. And so what we really need is a whole of government approach to deal with these challenges and a whole of society approach to make our society resilient against these types of attempts at interference. And I think as long as we continue to try to deal with these and sort of siloed capabilities, or simply make this a defense problem or a security problem or so, we're going to continue to fall short, and we will continue to leave significant cracks in the system for our adversaries to exploit.
Yeah, that's a very good way to look at it, and that approach, and definitely a long-term sustainability or reboot plan. But thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Leuprecht.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Christian Leuprecht is a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada at the Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario.